Have you ever wondered what the last thing you'd feel is, right before your soul is torn out by something that doesn't even see you as alive? The question hangs like a whisper in the void, but it isn't meant to frighten. It's meant to prepare, because anything you think you know about fear, pain, or the limits of human endurance becomes meaningless the moment the Drukhari set their eyes on you. I didn't know that, not then, not when my life was still my own, not when I still believed that death was the worst fate a human could suffer. I had no idea how naive that was. I had no idea that death, in comparison, is a mercy that the Drukhari do not give. Not until the night they came for us, fast as a blade, silent as a nightmare, hungry as gods. It began with a sound that shouldn't have existed. Not an explosion, not a weapon discharge, more like a tear. As if the air itself was fabric and something clawed its way through it. I remember looking up, thinking it was thunder, a storm, maybe the engines of passing Imperial craft. But the sky didn't flash with lightning. It ripped open. A long, violent streak of shimmering distortion split reality above us, and through that wound poured shapes that didn't obey the laws of nature. They moved like shadows that had learned to hate the light. They glided, twisted, and flickered, never solid, never still, always wrong. We didn't understand what we were seeing. We didn't even scream at first. We just stared, mesmerized and terrified, at the silhouettes dropping from the sky like living shards of night. They hit the ground without a sound. And then the screaming started. The Drukhari didn't attack the way raiders attack. They didn't shout, didn't roar, didn't fire warning shots. They simply began. One of them appeared beside a man standing only a few meters from me. I didn't even see the movement. One heartbeat the man was alive, the next his spine was hooked, severed, pulled out in a single motion that looked disturbingly graceful. The Drukhari assassin held the man's limp body aloft as if studying it, then dropped him like he was nothing more than an empty bag. Another victim was lifted by the throat, not crushed, not strangled, just held there, suspended, as his nerve endings lit up with agony from some toxin injected through the Drukhari's fingertips. He died convulsing, his eyes bulging with terror and disbelief. And still, not a word was spoken by the attackers. Just silence. Cold, deliberate silence. I tried to run. Everyone did. But how do you run from something faster than thought? I felt a sudden sting at the base of my neck, a sensation like icy fire boring into my spine. My legs collapsed beneath me. My vision blurred into streaks. My body refused to obey. I could see shapes moving around me, but I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even blink normally. I was trapped inside myself, aware but paralyzed, my mind clawing at the walls of my own skull as the world dissolved into madness. A Drukhari leaned over me, its face hidden behind a smooth, segmented mask. I saw my reflection in that mask, small, terrified, utterly powerless. I understood then that this wasn't just an attack. It was a harvest. I was lifted effortlessly, like I weighed nothing. A hook slipped beneath my shoulder blade, dragging me across the ground. I felt the metal grind bone and tear muscle, but the toxin in my veins muted the pain into something far worse, a dull, cold distortion, like pain happening to someone else whose body I happened to inhabit. The world grew distant and dreamlike as I was hauled toward the tear in the sky. Around me, others were being gathered like livestock. Some cried, some pleaded, some simply stared blankly, minds already broken. The Drukhari moved among us like predators selecting their favorite cuts, tapping victims with long needles, marking us, cataloging us. As they dragged me closer to the shimmering rift, the air grew wrong. Heavy, hungry, a static hum crawled over my skin, raising goosebumps like icy fingertips tracing my nerves. I didn't know what was on the other side. I only knew that nothing natural waited within that wound in reality. The Drukhari paused at its threshold as if savoring the moment. One of them tilted its head toward me, almost studying the fear in my eyes. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only feel the weight of its attention settle over me like a shroud. Then the world twisted, and I was pulled through. There are no words in any human language to describe the sensation of crossing into the webway. It felt like my mind was being stretched thin across dimensions, like my identity was smeared into a million shards and hastily reassembled. I felt myself dissolve. I felt myself burn. I felt myself reborn into something that wasn't meant to exist. And then, just as suddenly, everything snapped back together. I lay on a cold, jagged surface, gasping, paralyzed, my sanity flickering around the edges. Commorragh loomed above me, an impossible city carved from darkness and cruelty. Towers that spiraled like twisted bone. Walkways that pulsed like veins. Structures built from screaming metal and living shadows. And everywhere, were the sounds of torment. A constant, pervasive chorus of agony that echoed through the city as naturally as wind through an ancient forest. Screams of pain, of pleasure, of both twined together until they were indistinguishable. I had entered a realm built on suffering. A realm where death was forbidden. A realm where souls were currency. And I was now part of their economy. The Drukhari released the paralysis. Not to free me, but to watch me crawl. I would have preferred death. They didn't tell me to stand. They didn't need to. The moment the paralysis toxin faded, instinct took over and urged me to rise, to flee, to try anything at all, but nothing in my body worked the way it should. My limbs trembled violently, twitching and spasming as if my nerves had been rewired incorrectly. Every breath felt sharp, as if I were inhaling needles. The ground beneath me was warm, disturbingly warm, like the city itself breathed slow, feverish breaths. And in that moment, as I struggled to push myself upright, it dawned on me that Commorragh wasn't a city in the way humans understand cities. It was alive, and worse, it was hungry. A Drukhari guard nudged me with the flat of a blade. Not cutting, not stabbing, just tapping, reminding me of what would happen if I didn't move fast enough. I staggered forward, my legs buckling with each step. The path stretched ahead like a corridor carved from obsidian and metal that writhed in the corner of my vision. Above us, walkways twisted in impossible loops, crowded with elegant figures draped in cruel armor, their faces hidden behind masks of shimmering malice. Some paused to watch the new arrivals. Some pointed, some laughed, a soft, musical, chilling sound that made my stomach twist. To them, we were entertainment long before we were even prisoners. The deeper we were pushed into the city, the more I felt something pressing against my mind, like a cold hand sliding across the back of my thoughts. It wasn't psychic in the way the Imperium fears psychers. It wasn't magic. It was hunger, pure, emotional, predatory hunger. Commorragh radiated it. The very air seemed laced with it. Here, suffering wasn't just inflicted, it was inhaled, processed, savored. I sensed it in the shadows, in the walls, in the half-formed wails that echoed through the crooked streets. This was a world that thrived on pain the way we thrive on oxygen. We were herded down a narrow passage that ended in a cavernous chamber lit by sickly violet light. The smell hit first: rot, formaldehyde, hot metal, old blood, and something else, something chemical and sweet that clung to the back of the throat. The room opened into a sprawling marketplace, but instead of stalls selling goods, it displayed cages. Hundreds of them, thousands, humans, Eldari, Tau, creatures I didn't recognize, all imprisoned, all broken in different ways. Some whispered to themselves, some stared blankly, some clung to the bars and hissed warnings that made no sense, speaking in broken murmurs about the flesh artists, the bone gardeners, the ones who peel your thoughts. I didn't have time to process their words. A Haemonculi emerged from the gloom. If the Drukhari warriors were fear, the Haemonculi were terror sculpted into flesh. The thing before me was tall and impossibly thin, skin stretched taut like parchment over bone that didn't align in any way a skeleton should. Its limbs were extended with extra joints, each movement disturbingly fluid, like wet silk sliding over itself. Mechanical limbs protruded from its spine, 3 of them, tipped with tools that glimmered in the grim light. Hooks, scalpels, syringes filled with swirling ink-black fluids. The creature's face was wrong, too smooth, too calm, too symmetrical. Eyes like polished voids regarded us with clinical intrigue. It didn't speak aloud, it whispered directly into the mind. Fresh canvas. The words crawled through my skull like a parasite. Some prisoners whimpered, some vomited. I froze, not because of fear, though fear was all-consuming, but because I felt something else in that whisper. Interest. The Haemonculi paused in front of me, leaning close enough that I could smell its breath, a scent like ancient dust and burned incense. A long, needle-thin finger traced the line of my jaw, gently, almost affectionately. My body tensed involuntarily, my muscles spasming in protest. The creature's black eyes narrowed with fascination. Then it moved on. The Drukhari forced us through a gate that closed behind us with a grinding scream of metal. Inside were rows of pens, open-topped cages made from jagged, barbed material that seemed to pulse faintly. The floor was uneven, forcing us to kneel in ways that made joints ache. We weren't given food. We weren't given water. The Drukhari didn't even look at us after tossing us inside. We were property now, categorized and forgotten until boredom or curiosity brought our captors back. Hours passed, maybe days. Time twisted here, the sky never shifted, the shadows never moved. Screams drifted constantly from distant chambers, sometimes rising into crescendos of agony, sometimes falling into low, hollow moans that vibrated through the air. Some prisoners tried to sleep. Some stared at the ground. Some clutched their heads, muttering fractured prayers to the Emperor. The prayers didn't help, not here, not in a place the Emperor's light could never reach. Then the floor trembled. A low rumble moved through the pen, vibrating through bone. Prisoners tensed. Some scrambled backward in panic. A few curled into balls and wept. We didn't need to be told what it meant. Something was coming. Something that enjoyed the tremor of terror more than the act of killing. A group of Drukhari warriors appeared, pulling prisoners from the cages one by one, choosing them the way one chooses animals for culling. A guard grabbed the man beside me and yanked him out. He begged, choking on his words. Another guard pulled a woman, kicking and clawing, her nails breaking against armor that did not yield. Then a shadow fell over me. A hand gripped my collar and lifted me as if I weighed nothing. I struggled, not to escape, because that was impossible, but because some primal instinct refused to accept that my life was over. The Drukhari merely laughed, a quiet, musical sound of amusement. They dragged us deeper into the maze of the city. As we moved, I saw glimpses of horrors that defied explanation. Rooms where bodies hung suspended, twitching in rhythmic spasms as mechanical tendrils worked on them. Chambers where spectral shapes, souls, I realized, floated within glass containers, their silent screams echoing without sound. Corridors lined with trophies that were not trophies but fragments of people. I didn't know where they were taking us. But I knew one thing. Wherever we were going, it would be worse than anything we had seen so far. And there would be no mercy. The corridor narrowed until it felt like we were being funneled into the throat of some vast, living creature. The walls were not stone, not metal, something in between. They pulsed faintly, as though veins ran beneath their surface. Prisoners around me whimpered as the floor shifted under our feet, warm and uneven, like we were walking across the ribs of something breathing just beneath the surface. The air thickened with a chemical sweetness that burned the lungs and made the tongue taste like copper. I knew, even before we reached the chamber ahead, that whatever was coming would change us. Perhaps forever, perhaps in ways no human mind was meant to endure. The entrance to the flesh pits did not open. It peeled away, like flesh parting under a scalpel. A wave of heat rolled over us, carrying the stench of blood, antiseptic, molten metal, and something sickeningly organic, like meat left out too long in a damp cellar. The room beyond was enormous, stretching farther than the eye could follow, the ceiling hidden behind shadows that writhed as though things crawled just beyond sight. Tables, if they could be called that, lined the floor. Some were metal, some bone, some grown from some twisted amalgamation of both. And upon them, bodies. Living bodies, twisting, screaming, reduced to shapes the mind rejected. A haemonculus glided forward, not the same one who had inspected us earlier. This one was smaller, more hunched, but its presence commanded the entire room. Its spine arched unnaturally, supporting a cluster of mechanical limbs tipped with tools so delicate they might have been surgical instruments, or torture devices, or both. Its face was devoid of emotion, yet somehow more expressive than any snarl or grin. Its calmness told us everything. Suffering wasn't passion for it. It was routine, and we were just a task on its schedule. It approached the first prisoner in line, a man shaking uncontrollably, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. The haemonculus tilted its head, observing him as if considering what part of him to begin with. A long, hooked instrument unfurled from one of its mechanical limbs with a clicking sound. The man begged, he cried, he promised things, information, loyalty, anything. It didn't matter. The haemonculus slid the hook beneath his skin with such practiced ease that the man didn't scream immediately. He gasped, eyes bulging, mouth opening silently like a drowning swimmer. Then the scream came, a raw, ripping sound that echoed across the chamber and made every other prisoner collapse into sobs or prayers. The haemonculus didn't flinch, it didn't even look at the man as it began to peel him open. Its attention was elsewhere, on us. It wanted us to watch. We were not in a torture chamber. We were in a classroom. The Drukhari guards shoved us forward until we stood directly beside the tables. I tried to look away. I tried not to see the way the haemonculus separated flesh from muscle with the same rhythm one uses to peel fruit. I tried not to hear the sound the man's vocal cords made as they tore, but the Drukhari wanted our eyes open. A blade pressed gently against my cheek, forcing my head back toward the horror. Even flinching was punished by a tap of a shock baton that sent electricity rippling through my spine until my vision exploded in white. Another prisoner beside me fainted from fear. The Drukhari didn't bother dragging him away. They simply sank a needle into the base of his skull and flooded him with something that ripped him back into consciousness with a howl so guttural it didn't sound human anymore. We were not allowed to look away. The Haemonculi continued its work, removing organs not to kill, but to display them. To study the reactions. To savor every twitch, every flicker of nerve response. When the man finally stopped screaming, his voice broken into mere gasps, the Haemonculi injected something into his open chest cavity. The effect was instant. The man jerked upright, as if reborn, and the screaming began anew, stronger, louder, impossibly more agonized. It was then I understood the true horror. Death was not an exit here. It was a privilege denied. The Haemonculi finished with the man and turned toward us. It gestured lazily, and the guards began pulling prisoners from the line. One by one, they were strapped onto tables, their terror rising in frantic waves that infected everyone still standing. I tried to step back. A guard seized me by the hair and forced me forward, dragging me toward an empty table grown from bone that still glistened as if freshly carved. I dug my heels into the warm floor, but it softened around my feet, offering no resistance. My hands clawed at the air. My breath came in shallow, desperate gulps. I tried to form words, pleas, bargains, curses, anything. But nothing came out. The Haemonculi leaned in close, its cold, ancient eyes studying the fear in mine. It placed a single finger on my forehead, tracing a line down the bridge of my nose. My entire skull vibrated with a strange, electric warmth that crept into the back of my mind, probing, examining, dissecting me emotionally the way it dissected bodies physically. I felt exposed. Not physically, but spiritually. As though it could see every memory, every flaw, every hope I still clung to. Then, without explanation, it withdrew its hand. A mechanical limb lifted, hovering over my chest, but instead of descending, it paused. The Haemonculi whispered a single phrase, its voice barely audible yet echoing inside my skull like a living echo. Not yet. Two guards shoved me aside, pushing me back into the line. The table that had been waiting for me closed itself, folding inward like a mouth swallowing a meal it had been denied. I stumbled backward, barely keeping my balance. I wasn't spared. I was saved for something specific. Something worse. And I didn't know what. The first night, or what passed for night in Commorragh, was the longest I have ever known. Time here was a joke, a cruel trick the city played on its captives. There was no sun. There were no stars. There was only the hum of the living walls, the distant screams that never ceased, and the faint, dripping sound of something leaking, blood, oil, or both, I could never tell. My limbs ached in ways I had not thought possible. I could feel every cut, every scrape, every puncture from the brief encounter with the guards, though none should have been lethal. Pain in Commorragh was not linear, it was recursive. It echoed in the muscles, bounced in the bones, and settled in the mind until every thought was soaked in it. We were herded into cages, though the word, cage, was generous. The enclosures were jagged, uneven, twisted into shapes that cut and bruised. We were packed like animals, forced into positions that would break our spines over time. Hunger was immediate, thirst was insistent, but the Haemonculi and their guards fed only when they were entertained, not when we were desperate. Some prisoners clawed at the bars, banging their heads against the jagged edges in the hope that injury, even serious injury, might elicit a reaction. Most were ignored, some were selected for the next demonstration of cruelty. I counted myself lucky just to be left alive. Luck, I would learn, was relative in Commorragh. The days, or whatever fragments of time could be called days, were filled with routines designed to break us more efficiently than brute force could ever achieve. We were prodded, poked, and injected with strange substances. Pain was applied and then retracted, leaving the nerves hypersensitive and the mind disoriented. A needle could touch the skin, and the sensation would travel deep into the bones, as if the entire body remembered every trauma it had ever suffered. Every noise was amplified, every shadow might hide a Drukhari, waiting to observe, waiting to punish, waiting to take another measure of our fear. I met some of the others only in fleeting moments, whispered words between cages, eyes meeting across the chaos of the pit. There was the soldier from a dead Imperial Guard regiment who kept talking to himself, reciting oaths that seemed meaningless here. There was a young Aeldari caught far from home, who trembled whenever the Haemonculi passed, muttering about honor and vengeance that could never reach us. There was a man who had been here for longer than I dared calculate, his eyes hollow, yet bright with a dangerous cunning that suggested he had survived by becoming something less than human, something less than moral. Each of them taught me, unwillingly, how to survive, the cost of looking down, the danger of flinching, the wisdom of silence. The Haemonculi themselves became a constant presence. Not just observers, but curators of agony. One, a small, wiry thing with a spine like a lattice of steel, seemed to take particular interest in my reactions. It studied the way my eyes widened, the quiver of my lips, the tremble in my fingers. Sometimes, it would whisper into my mind, testing boundaries, probing thoughts. "Your fear is exquisite," it would murmur, as though I were a note it could play, a melody it could perfect. There was no comfort in survival, only the ever-present anticipation of what it might do next. Weeks, or perhaps months, passed in this manner. The city, the Haemonculi, the guards, they all became an extension of a single purpose: to remove hope, shred sanity, and teach the art of obedience through suffering. Every day blurred into the next. My reflection in broken metal or puddles of black water, if it could be called reflection, showed someone I barely recognized. My hands shook constantly, my spine a tangle of muscle and nerve in permanent tension. I could no longer remember a life beyond these walls. I only remembered survival. The first attempt at rebellion came without warning. A group of prisoners, emboldened or desperate, tried to seize a moment when the guards were distracted. It was chaos. Screams filled the chamber, louder and more piercing than anything I had ever heard. Metal screamed against metal, flesh tore against flesh, and within moments, the Haemonculi arrived. They did not fight, they watched, they calculated, and when the revolt ended, it had been purged with precision and artistry, leaving behind a tableau that seared itself into my mind. Survivors mangled, some barely alive, others mutilated into forms no human should recognize, all of them reminders of the futility of resistance. I understood then that rebellion here was not bravery. It was an invitation to be remade. I survived that day by hiding, by becoming smaller, quieter, less visible than any shadow. I discovered the first truth about life in Commorragh. It was not merely suffering that the Drukhari sought, but the stripping of identity. Names, memories, loyalties, all were eroded until nothing remained but fear and instinct. And yet, even in that unbearable place, tiny sparks of thought persisted. Thoughts of escape, thoughts of vengeance, thoughts of self, dangerous thoughts, thoughts that might draw attention, thoughts that might kill me faster than anything the Haemonculi or their guards could devise. But those thoughts were mine. For now, the Drukhari who ruled the flesh pits were not merely guards. They were artists of agony, connoisseurs of despair. Each one moved with elegance that made every act of cruelty seem deliberate, rehearsed, almost poetic. One would run a blade along the arm of a prisoner without cutting deeply, just enough to draw a scream and watch it echo through the chamber. Another would inject a subtle toxin that made the mind twist, conjuring hallucinations more terrifying than any physical injury could produce. They observed us as though cataloging each reaction, learning the limits of our bodies and minds with obsessive precision. Pain here was not accidental, it was measured, refined, and consumed with the satisfaction of a feast. Among the prisoners, stories emerged slowly, whispered between cages or shared in the rare moments when the Drukhari were distracted. There was a sergeant from a shattered Imperial Guard regiment who had been dragged from his planet during the chaos of a raid. His voice was hoarse from months of screaming, but he spoke of camaraderie, of soldiers who had died beside him in battles he could barely remember. There was a Tau engineer, young and trembling, who muttered of worlds he would never see again, of machines he would never repair. And there was an Aeldari warrior, captured during a raid, whose eyes burned with a quiet rage that even the Haemonculi seemed to respect, though grudgingly. These fragments of life, snippets of memory and identity, hung in the air, fragile threads in a tapestry of despair, offering brief reminders of what the city tried to erase. I listened, learning what I could, absorbing the warnings and strategies hidden in their words. Some had been here longer, and they carried scars deeper than flesh. They whispered of the hierarchy among the captives. Those who endured longest were not necessarily the strongest, but the quietest, the most observant, the ones who learned to anticipate every cruelty before it struck. Trust was fleeting, alliances rarer. Betrayal came quickly in the city of the Drukhari, often without warning. I learned to nod, to smile faintly, to speak only when absolutely necessary. Each moment of exposure could be deadly, each misstep could draw the attention of someone whose idea of amusement was to push a mind past the brink. The Haemonculi, in particular, fascinated and terrified me. One of them, a small, wiry figure with a crown of metallic spikes, took interest in my reactions in a way that set me apart from the other prisoners. It would watch quietly, observing my attempts to hide trembling hands or a flinch, waiting for moments when fear betrayed me. Sometimes, it whispered into my mind, probing, testing boundaries, injecting subtle fear that wasn't physical but mental, a slow invasion of the self. Interesting, it would say. You react differently. I never understood what it meant by differently, but the words haunted me. To be singled out was both a curse and, perversely, a kind of recognition. I existed here, in a way no one else did. Weeks blurred together. Hunger gnawed at the stomach. Thirst burned the throat. The constant anticipation of torment frayed nerves and blurred reality. I began to notice things I shouldn't have, the subtle differences in toxins, the variations in pain, the almost imperceptible cues that a guard would act. My mind sharpened in response, instinct overtaking conscious thought. It was survival, it was adaptation, and it was terrifying, because every lesson was paid for in blood and suffering, mine and others. Occasionally, there were moments when a prisoner would vanish, snatched without warning, leaving behind only the echo of a scream. Those who remained speculated quietly, horrified, about the fate of the taken, experiments, games, art forms of cruelty too unspeakable to imagine. Each disappearance was a lesson for the rest of us. Watch, obey, endure, and remember that no mercy awaited anyone. The stories, the observations, the whispers, they all merged into a constant background noise, a rhythm of survival. I learned to measure my reactions, to predict the smallest shifts in the Drukhari's attention, to hide fear while feeling it in full force. But even as I adapted, I realized something darker. This was not a place to merely survive. This was a place that demanded transformation. Some prisoners went mad, others died, but a few changed into something else entirely, shadows of themselves, hollowed and sharpened, molded by the city and its tormentors. And as much as I wanted to resist, I felt the edges of that transformation already brushing against me. The Drukhari were patient. They did not rush. They allowed the terror to sink in slowly, until survival itself became a weapon turned inward. And then, one day, the whispers of escape began. Not among the prisoners themselves. Not yet, but a subtle shift in the Haemonculi's attention, a hint in the guard's movements, a pattern forming in the timing of our torments. It was a dangerous insight, dangerous to know, dangerous to acknowledge, but it was the first glimmer of something I had not thought possible in this city of unending suffering, a possibility that survival might not only mean endurance, but action. That perhaps, even here, in Commorragh, one could fight back. I held on to that thought. Fragile as it was, it became a lifeline. In a place designed to strip hope from the soul, holding on to a single thought of defiance was more potent than any weapon. More dangerous, too, because the city watched, and it learned. And I would soon understand just how precise and patient its cruelty could be. The first escape attempt began quietly, almost imperceptibly, and ended in chaos the likes of which I had never imagined. A group of prisoners, emboldened by whispered courage and the smallest flickers of hope, tried to take advantage of a moment when the Drukhari guard's attention seemed elsewhere. They moved like shadows across the jagged floor, coordinated in a way that suggested desperation could give birth to cunning. I wanted to join them, or perhaps I wanted to stop them, though I couldn't have said why. My mind had grown both hyper-aware and fragmented, filled with the constant tension of fear and the yearning for freedom. And then it began, the moment when hope collided with the merciless reality of Commorragh. Screams erupted almost instantly, piercing the stagnant air with a rawness that felt unnatural. The guards, who had appeared inattentive, moved with impossible speed, catching the first few prisoners before they had crossed half the distance to potential freedom. The Haemonculi arrived moments later, gliding silently, their mechanical limbs weaving a web of terror. They did not strike immediately. They watched, studied, measured, and allowed the chaos to escalate to the maximum emotional and physical effect. Then, when the moment was most terrifying, they acted. Pain fell upon the rebels like rainfall, precise, surgical, and unrelenting. Flesh tore. Screams multiplied, fear radiated outward, infecting everyone still standing. Some prisoners tried to flee into corners, hoping to hide from the inevitable, but the city itself seemed to move against them, narrowing corridors, twisting pathways, guiding them into the hands of their tormentors. I watched from my place in the shadows, paralyzed not by a toxin, but by the horror of understanding too much. Survival here was not about strength. It was about being invisible, about learning the rules the city and its masters enforced without mercy. Some of those who had attempted escape were transformed in ways too grotesque to describe, skin grafted incorrectly, muscles frozen mid-twitch, nerve endings reprogrammed to make every touch agony. The screams never truly stopped. They became a constant backdrop, embedding themselves into the mind like barbed wire. I realized then the second truth about Commorragh: rebellion was not punished merely to teach fear. Rebellion was harvested. Each act of defiance became a lesson, a tool, a weapon fashioned from the broken bodies and minds of the prisoners. After the chaos subsided, I stumbled backward into a corner, my hands pressed over my ears as if I could block out the screams that reverberated in my skull. My mind began to fracture. Shadows moved at the edge of my vision, indistinct shapes that whispered in languages I could almost understand. Hallucinations rose and fell like tides, each one more vivid than the last, hands reaching from the walls, eyes appearing where no face existed, whispers calling my name in tones of both comfort and horror. I could no longer tell which sensations were real and which had been conjured by fear or the subtle manipulations of the Haemonculi. Every breath burned, every heartbeat felt too loud, every nerve screamed. I understood the third truth about Commorragh: the mind was as fragile as the body, and far more dangerous to ignore. Somewhere in the darkness, the Haemonculus who had taken an interest in me appeared, not speaking aloud but sending thoughts directly into my skull. Interesting, you watched carefully. You survived the chaos, but observe this: the mind breaks first. I felt my own thoughts twist under its scrutiny, twisting into fears I had never had, fears I had always denied. The hallucinations grew stronger. Faces of fellow prisoners appeared, screaming silently. Doors that led nowhere stretched infinitely. I could feel my memories leaking, bits of my past slipping away like water through fingers. Names, dates, faces, blurred. Hope itself began to feel foreign, a memory from someone else's life. And yet, even as my mind fractured under the unrelenting pressure, a small, defiant thought remained. The possibility of escape, the faint, dangerous ember that whispered, if they can make us suffer, perhaps we can learn their patterns. Perhaps we can survive this. Perhaps we can fight back. It was fragile, almost laughable, but it was mine. For now. Commorragh had taken much, but it had not yet taken my will entirely. And in that sliver of defiance, however small, I realized that survival would require more than endurance. It would require cunning, patience, and the willingness to face horrors that no human mind was meant to comprehend. The days, or what passed for days, merged into an unbroken rhythm of torment. I had learned to anticipate the Haemonculi's movements, to predict the guards' patterns, to hide the tremors of fear beneath a calm mask. But survival alone was not enough. I was no longer merely a prisoner. I had become an observer, a cataloger of the cruelty around me. And as I watched, a subtle shift began to emerge in the patterns, in the timing, in the behavior of my captors. Something imperceptible to most would have gone unnoticed, but I noticed. I noticed the faint hesitation of one guard, the deliberate avoidance of my cage by another. And then, finally, I noticed the Haemonculus itself, not the one who had tormented me directly, but another, smaller, wiry figure, moving differently than its peers. Its interest seemed selective, almost deliberate, almost helpful. I did not trust it. Trust in Commorragh was a concept as foreign as mercy. Yet the sensation it provoked was undeniable, the first flicker of something dangerously close to hope. A brush of recognition, a signal hidden in behavior rather than words, that hinted the city itself was not entirely uniform in its cruelty. There were factions, games, rivalries. The Drukhari were patient, yes, but they were also meticulous in their calculations. And where calculation exists, opportunity may follow. I had seen the Haemonculus study the prisoners' reactions to torment. I had seen how it catalogued fear and survival with clinical precision. And I had realized that perhaps, in that observation, lay a chance for leverage, if one could survive the observation itself. The small Haemonculus began leaving traces, subtle manipulations in the cages, changes in the routine that were imperceptible to the others, but unmistakable to me. A guard distracted just long enough for me to move a fraction of an inch in safety. A doorway slightly less monitored, a mechanical limb hovering briefly without striking. Tiny openings, almost accidental in appearance, but deliberate in effect. The city remained a predator, but now it seemed, for reasons I could not fathom, to be offering a thread of possibility. And the realization was terrifying. Any misstep could result in death, or worse. But any success might be the first step toward escape. It was during one of these rare, fleeting moments that I began to notice the true nature of the Haemonculi's obsession with our minds. Pain was not simply inflicted, it was analyzed, observed, and catalogued. Weakness, fear, memory, hope, everything was measured. Some prisoners were broken too quickly. Others were preserved, and I sensed that I had been preserved, studied, measured, and perhaps, chosen. Not as a reward, certainly, but for reasons I could not yet comprehend. The idea that my suffering had purpose, beyond survival itself, was as frightening as it was compelling. I began listening, watching, memorizing. The whispers of other prisoners, the pauses in guards' movements, the faint rhythm in the Haemonculi's steps, all of it became part of a dangerous calculus. I understood the fourth truth about Commorragh: survival alone would not suffice. To endure was necessary, but not sufficient. One had to read the predators, to learn the hidden rules, to recognize the cracks in the relentless system of cruelty. And if one could do that, if one could learn the game, they might live long enough to fight, to escape, or even to manipulate the manipulators. For the first time since my capture, I began to feel the stirrings of something that had been denied to me: agency. The possibility that I could act, rather than merely react. But with agency came understanding, and with understanding came terror. To act meant choosing, and every choice in Commorragh demanded a price. And yet, even as the weight of that knowledge pressed down on me, a small, dangerous spark flickered in the darkness of my mind. Perhaps survival could become more than endurance. Perhaps it could become defiance. The Haemonculus observed this flicker, and I felt it, faintly, as a weight pressing against the back of my consciousness. Interesting, it whispered in my skull, though the sound was not sound at all, more like a ripple in the edges of thought. You are learning. Observe, survive, endure. And with that, it withdrew, leaving me with the first truly dangerous thought I had harbored since my capture. If I could learn the rules of their cruelty, perhaps I could use them. Perhaps I could turn the city's own patience against it. Perhaps I could escape. And the thought burned like a beacon in the endless shadows of Commorragh, promising both hope and a peril I had never known before. I began to move differently. Not physically, but mentally, in ways I had never imagined possible under constant terror. Every twitch of a guard, every twitch of a Haemonculus's mechanical limb, every pattern of their attention became a data point in my mind. Where others panicked, I observed. Where others flinched, I calculated. Fear was no longer something I tried to hide. It became a tool, a mask, a camouflage. I learned to react just enough, to tremble, to shiver, to jerk, in ways that satisfied their expectations without revealing the deeper currents of my thoughts. Every measured reaction, every carefully placed flinch, was a step toward survival. And perhaps, just perhaps, a step towards something more dangerous: control. The other prisoners remained my fragile mirrors. I watched them as much as I watched the tormentors. Their behaviors, their mistakes, their breakdowns, all became lessons. I noticed who could endure longer, who could anticipate the rhythm of cruelty, who adapted and who failed. Patterns emerged. Even in a city designed to erase identity, the Haemonculi and their minions followed a logic, a cruel and twisted logic, but one that could be read if one paid attention. Survival became a game of observation, of anticipation, of tiny experiments with rules that could not be broken but might be bent. And so, I began testing. Small movements at first, subtle shifts of posture or gaze, a hesitation that suggested weakness. I watched how the guards reacted, how the Haemonculi reacted, what punishments followed, and which did not. I began to map the invisible threads of authority, the unseen hierarchy of cruelty, the subtle distinctions between who could be broken quickly and who required patience. Each lesson cost fear, sometimes pain, sometimes a glance that could have ended me. But each lesson was invaluable. The city spoke in a language of torment, and I had begun to learn it. I understood, finally, that Commorragh was not chaotic. It was methodical. Every scream, every twitch, every moment of terror was catalogued and analyzed. The Haemonculi did not merely enjoy suffering, they refined it, optimized it, turned it into a weapon that could bend body and mind. And now I was learning to read that weapon, to anticipate its strikes, to move just enough to survive but not enough to draw undue attention. I was learning the calculus of cruelty, and in that knowledge lay a fragile advantage, a dangerous spark of hope. But the realization was double-edged. For every rule I discerned, for every pattern I anticipated, I also understood the stakes. Miscalculation meant death, or worse. Every moment of awareness brought both insight and terror. Every flicker of opportunity was accompanied by the potential for complete annihilation. Yet I continued. I had to. Because in a city that devoured hope as easily as air, in a place where survival was no longer guaranteed by strength or endurance alone, knowledge was the only weapon I had. Observation was survival. Calculation was survival. Patience was survival. And the faint, dangerous hope that I might one day turn these lessons into action became the fragile thread I clung to in the endless darkness. It was during one of these cycles of observation that I noticed something I had not seen before. The Haemonculi that had shown interest in me was not merely cataloging reactions, it was testing boundaries. Not with brute force, not with immediate pain, but with subtle, almost imperceptible manipulations. A light touch of a needle here, a pause in attention there, a faint, almost accidental sound that suggested danger. Each test was minor, but cumulative. And each one revealed something about me, my fears, my instinctive reactions, my capacity for endurance. I realized, with a chill that froze my blood, that I was being studied as much as any prisoner on the tables. Perhaps more. And yet, in that terrifying scrutiny, I discovered the possibility of a game. If I could understand the rules of their observation, if I could anticipate the tests, if I could bend my reactions just enough, perhaps I could manipulate the manipulators. Perhaps I could survive not only physically but strategically. Perhaps I could turn the patience of Commorragh, and the precision of the Haemonculi, into an ally of sorts, not a friend, not a savior, but a calculated instrument in the deadly calculus that governed this city of nightmares. The thought was intoxicating, and dangerous. And I clung to it, as carefully as I clung to my own fraying sanity. The first step toward survival was observation. The second step, if I could live long enough, might be action. And I had learned that in Commorragh, every act of survival, every measured twitch, every whispered thought, was already an act of defiance. It began with a glance. A subtle shift of eyes across the cage, unnoticed by the guards, unremarkable to anyone but me. A prisoner, the Ealdari warrior I had watched in silence for weeks, had made eye contact, brief and fleeting, but heavy with meaning. In that instant, I recognized a truth I had not allowed myself to consider. Even here, even in Commorragh, we were not entirely isolated. The city was vast, its cruelty meticulously divided, but some prisoners had learned to watch each other as much as they watched the tormentors. In the smallest gestures, in the faintest exchange of attention, connections could form. Alliances could emerge, hope could be sown, though it remained a dangerous seed. We began slowly, a nod here, a shift of weight there, a shared understanding that words could betray us more than silence. Information exchanged silently. Which guards moved when, which Haemonculi showed interest, which corridors were slightly less monitored. Each detail was trivial alone, but together, they formed a lattice of knowledge, a network invisible to the city, invisible to the tormentors, invisible to anyone but those willing to pay the cost of attention. And the cost was high. A single misstep could result in immediate selection for the tables, or worse, the prolonged study of pain reserved for those who drew the Haemonculi's curiosity. As we watched, we began to notice patterns in the chaos. The Haemonculi operated with both precision and ritual. Pain was not arbitrary, it followed a rhythm, a logic embedded in timing, in repetition, in calculated escalation. Guards moved in cycles, always returning to predictable points. Toxins were administered in waves, their effects observable and measurable. Even the screams, terrible as they were, had a cadence, a structure, a way in which the city dictated terror like a teacher demonstrating a lesson. And if we could understand this structure, if we could anticipate it, we could find the moments between strikes, the small gaps in the endless cycle, the briefest breathing spaces where survival became slightly more than mere endurance. We practiced silently, small experiments, subtle deviations, a twitch delayed, a flinch exaggerated, a gaze shifted strategically. Each act was tiny, almost imperceptible, but each was a test of our understanding. Each was a measure of our courage and intelligence. We learned to read the Haemonculi's attention, to recognize the signs of imminent pain or observation, to anticipate the moment when intervention was necessary, or when inaction was safer. We began to see the faint outlines of possibility, an exit route glimpsed in the endless corridors, a shift in guard rotations that might be exploitable, a pattern in the way the city moved its prisoners from cage to cage. It was fragile, it was dangerous, it was nearly impossible, but it was there. And in that fragile possibility, we began to speak. Not aloud, never aloud, but in the language of survival, gestures, glances, subtle signals. Trust was not freely given. It was earned in the smallest increments. A nod here, a mirrored action there, a shared response to a small infliction of pain, all of it became proof. Proof that we were paying attention, that we were capable, that we were willing to act together, carefully, deliberately, with precision. And the thought that we might act together, even minimally, was terrifying in its potential consequences. Yet terrifying as it was also intoxicating. For the first time since my capture, I felt a thread of agency that was real, not imagined, not forced by circumstance, but carved out by careful observation, shared knowledge, and quiet defiance. We were no longer merely surviving. We were beginning to understand the rules. And in understanding the rules, we began to imagine bending them. The day came without warning, though we had been preparing for it in silence for what felt like an eternity. Every glance, every subtle gesture, every hidden understanding between the remaining prisoners converged into a single, fragile plan. We moved not with reckless hope, but with the careful patience we had honed over countless cycles of pain and observation. Each step, each measured breath, was a negotiation with fear itself. Commorragh remained a predator, its every shadow alive, its every corridor a threat, but we had learned its rhythms, we had mapped its cruelty, and for the first time, we believed, even if only for a heartbeat, that we could act against it. The Haemonculi, ever observing, watched. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps amusement, or perhaps it saw the faintest spark of danger in our calculated restraint. It did not intervene immediately. It allowed us to test the boundaries, to measure the risks, to see how far a fragment of agency could extend within the city's relentless grip. Each small success was a step forward, a cage unlocked just long enough for one of us to slip through, a guard distracted for a fraction of a heartbeat, a mechanical limb hesitating. And in those brief windows, our collective will coalesced. Survival was no longer passive, it had become a weapon. We moved like shadows, silent, precise, coordinated without words. Every misstep could mean death, every tremor could betray us. And yet, even in the suffocating, pulsing darkness of Commorragh, a strange exhilaration burned through us. This was not victory, it was defiance. It was rebellion distilled into its most dangerous form, the refusal to be completely broken. The city, with all its cruelty, all its calculated torment, had created an opening we could exploit, and we would take it. The corridors twisted and turned, as they always had, but now they were maps we could read. The Haemonculi's eyes lingered, calculating, but we anticipated its movements. Guards approached and passed, oblivious to the rhythm of our survival. And finally, we reached the point where the walls themselves seemed to pulse in a different cadence, where the air felt thinner, sharper, freer. A doorway loomed, a possibility, a threshold, a risk that could either be our salvation or our annihilation. And we stepped through. I will not pretend it was easy. The city did not yield lightly. A guard lunged, a blade swung, a scream pierced the darkness. But instinct, observation, and the fragile, deadly trust we had built carried us through. One by one, we emerged from the corridors that had once imprisoned us, not unscathed, not unbroken, but alive, conscious, still human, still aware. Commorragh had taken much from us, our comfort, our safety, our innocence, but it had not taken our agency. Not entirely, not yet. That small ember of defiance, cultivated in silence, in observation, in terror, had become our lifeline. Even as we fled, I knew the city would remember. The Haemonculi would catalog this escape, refine its tortures, perfect its methods, and in some cruel future, our survival might become a lesson for the next victims. Commorragh was eternal. The Drukhari were patient, but in that instant, we were free. Not safe, not whole, but alive, and in the face of a universe designed to consume us, that was enough. And somewhere in the shadows, the faint echo of the city's hunger followed, a whisper of warning, reminding us that freedom was temporary, survival was precious, and terror, though momentarily evaded, would always wait in the dark. But for now, we had won. And for now, we were ourselves again, if only barely.